They say when you marry into money, you inherit more than just wealth. You inherit secrets. You inherit silence. You inherit the kind of lies that have been polished so smooth they shine like the truth. I believed I was living a fairy tale for 3 years. 3 years of champagne breakfasts, designer gowns, and a husband whose smile could light up the darkest corners of my wounded heart. 3 years of sleeping in silk sheets worth more than my entire childhood home. 3 years of being called Mrs. Vallemont, the wife of the most eligible bachelor in the entire Eastern Seaboard. And then, on the evening of our 3rd anniversary, while I stood in the corridor outside my husband's study, I heard the words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. You were never supposed to fall in love with her, Theron. The voice belonged to Cordelia Vallemont, my mother-in-law. Cold, sharp, dripping with the kind of contempt she always tried to hide behind her practiced smiles. You were supposed to marry her, produce an heir, and maintain appearances. That was the arrangement. That is why we pulled you from the servants' quarters and dressed you in suits worth more than your father earns in a decade. I pressed my hand against the wall, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. Your father is polishing the silver right now, Cordelia continued. Aldrich has served this family for 37 years. He knows his place. And you, dear boy, seem to have forgotten yours. You are not a Vallemont. You never were. You are the butler's secret son, playing a role we scripted for you when Cassius died. The crystal vase I had been carrying slipped from my fingers. It exploded against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire mansion. Through the years, through every kiss, every whispered promise, every moment I believed was real. The study door flew open, and there he stood, Theron, my husband, the man I had given my entire heart to. His eyes, those beautiful storm-gray eyes that I had fallen into so many times, were filled with something I had never seen before. Fear. Raw, desperate fear. Seraphina, he breathed. How much did you hear? I couldn't answer. I couldn't breathe. The man standing before me suddenly looked like a stranger wearing my husband's face. The broad shoulders I had rested my head against, the hands that had wiped my tears, the lips that had promised me forever. All of it, dressed in the costume of a lie. Everything, I finally managed to say. I heard everything. Now, before I tell you what happened next, before I reveal how this moment led to the complete unraveling and eventual reconstruction of my entire existence, I need you to do something for me. If this story has already gripped your heart, if you're feeling that pull of curiosity mixed with that strange ache of recognition, tell me where you're watching from right now in the comments below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to share with you over these next chapters will take you on a journey you never expected. This story doesn't end where you think it does. Trust me. To understand how I ended up in that corridor, heart shattering on the marble floor along with that crystal vase, I need to take you back to the beginning, to the woman I was before I became Mrs. Vallemont. My name is Seraphina Marlowe. I grew up in a small coastal town called Belhaven, where the salt air clung to everything, and dreams of grandeur were considered foolish distractions from the practical business of surviving. My mother worked as a seamstress, her fingers always pricked and calloused from pushing needles through fabric meant for wealthy women she would never meet. My father left when I was 7, chasing something he never found, leaving behind nothing but a box of empty promises and a closet that smelled like his cologne for years after. I was not raised for luxury. I was raised for resilience. By the time I was 24, I had clawed my way through community college, earned a scholarship to study interior design, and landed a modest position at a prestigious design firm in the city. Elysian Interiors was known for catering to the obscenely wealthy, and I was just a junior designer, tasked mostly with fabric samples and coffee runs. But I was determined. I was hungry. I was convinced that if I worked hard enough, I could outrun the poverty that had shadowed my entire life. That's when I met him. Theron Valamont walked into our offices on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The autumn light caught his features as he pushed through the glass doors, and I remember thinking he looked like he had stepped out of a painting. Tall, with dark hair swept back from a face that was both aristocratic and approachable. He had the kind of presence that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention. Even Madame Colette, our notoriously unimpressible creative director, straightened her posture when he entered. "I need someone to redesign the east wing of my family's estate," he said, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. The previous designer had creative differences with my mother. I'm hoping to find someone with fresh eyes and fresh ideas. Madame Colette began introducing our senior designers, parading them before him like offerings to a god. But Theron's gaze had already drifted past them. It had landed on me. I was standing near the back, clutching a stack of fabric samples like a shield. I had not expected to be noticed. I never expected to be noticed. But there was something in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition of something I didn't yet understand, that made him point directly at me. "Her," he said. "I want her." The room went silent. Madame Colette's face cycled through several shades of displeasure before settling on a strained smile. "Mr. Valamont, surely one of our senior designers would be more appropriate for a project of this magnitude." "I've seen your portfolio," Theron interrupted, still looking at me. "You did the restoration work on the Bellamy cottage last spring. The way you blended historical accuracy with contemporary warmth, it was remarkable. I want that sensibility for our East Wing." I had worked on the Bellamy project as an assistant, staying late nights, contributing ideas that my supervisor had claimed as his own. But somehow, impossibly, Theron had noticed. He had noticed me. "I would be honored," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. What followed was 3 months of the most intense, intoxicating work of my life. I spent hours at the Valmont estate, a sprawling mansion called Thornwood Hall that seemed to stretch across the horizon like a kingdom unto itself. The halls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and every room whispered of old money and older secrets. Cordelia Valmont watched my every move with barely concealed suspicion, but Theron was my constant ally, my defender, my champion. We fell in love among the fabric samples and paint swatches. He would bring me coffee at midnight while I agonized over wallpaper patterns. I would catch him watching me with a softness in his eyes that made my breath catch. Our first kiss happened in the half-finished library, surrounded by the smell of fresh varnish and old books, and it felt like coming home to a place I had never been. "I didn't expect you," he whispered against my lips. I wasn't supposed to fall in love. At the time, I thought he meant that as a wealthy heir, he had been trained to view marriage as a transaction, not a romance. I thought he was marveling at the unexpected gift of genuine connection. Now, knowing what I know, those words take on a far darker meaning. He proposed 6 months after we met, in the garden of Thornwood Hall, beneath a canopy of wisteria that his gardeners had coaxed into bloom just for the occasion. The ring was a family heirloom, a stunning sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had allegedly belonged to a French countess. When he slipped it onto my finger, I wept with joy. My mother cried too, but hers were tears of disbelief. "The Valmonts?" she kept saying, shaking her head. "Seraphina, darling, those are the kinds of people we serve. We don't marry into them." But I thought I was different. I thought love had transcended the boundaries of class and circumstance. I thought I was proof that fairy tales could come true for girls from Belhaven, who grew up measuring their worth in the calluses on their mother's hands. The wedding was a spectacle that magazines begged to feature. 300 guests, a 12-tier cake, a dress designed by a legend who came out of retirement just for me. Cordelia smiled for the cameras, though her eyes remained cold. Leopold Valmont, Theron's father, or the man I believed to be his father, gave a toast about legacy and continuation that made everyone raise their glasses. And Aldrich, the butler, stood in the corner, his weathered face expressionless as he watched his son marry a woman who had no idea who she was truly marrying. I had noticed Aldrich before, of course. He was a permanent fixture at Thornwood Hall, as much a part of the estate as the stone walls themselves. A tall man, gaunt and gray, with hands that moved with precise efficiency, and eyes that seemed to hold entire libraries of unspoken thoughts. He had served the Valmonts for nearly 4 decades, and the staff spoke of him with a mixture of respect and distance. He was loyal. He was silent. He was invisible in the way that wealthy families preferred their servants to be. But sometimes, when Theron didn't think anyone was watching, I would catch him looking at Aldrich with an expression I couldn't quite name. There was longing there, and something that looked almost like guilt. Once, I walked into the kitchen to find them speaking in low voices, and they both fell silent the moment they saw me. Theron laughed it off, said he was checking on the evening's menu. Aldrich simply nodded and returned to polishing the silver. I thought nothing of it. I was so blinded by love, by the impossible fortune of my circumstances, that I dismissed every shadow, every whisper, every crack in the perfect facade. For 3 years, I played the role of Mrs. Valmont with dedication and grace. I hosted charity galas, redecorated rooms, smiled for cameras, and tried desperately to win Cordelia's approval. I lay beside my husband every night and believed with my whole heart that I knew him, that our love was built on a foundation of truth. And then came our anniversary, and the corridor, and the words that exposed the rotten truth beneath the gilded surface. You are the butler's secret son, playing a role we scripted for you. My husband was not who I thought he was. My marriage was built on a lie, and everything I believed about my life was about to collapse into dust. In the immediate aftermath of my discovery, time seemed to slow to an unbearable crawl. I remember standing there, shattered crystal glittering at my feet like fallen stars, staring at the man I thought I knew better than I knew myself. Theron's face had gone pale, his composure crumbling in real time before my eyes. Behind him, in the doorway of the study, Cordelia Valmont stood with her arms crossed, her expression shifting from shock to cold calculation. "Well," Cordelia said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "this is unfortunate. Unfortunate. 3 years of my life, my love, my devotion, reduced to an inconvenience in her ledger of carefully managed deceptions." "Seraphina, please," Theron started, stepping toward me with his hands outstretched. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" My voice came out as a whisper, but it carried the weight of a scream. That I've been living a lie? That my marriage is a fraud? That the man I fell in love with doesn't even exist? I exist, he insisted, desperation cracking through his carefully cultivated composure. Everything I felt for you, everything I feel for you, that's real. You have to believe me. How can I believe anything you say? I stepped back, my heel crunching against the broken crystal. Your entire identity is a fabrication. Cordelia moved then, stepping around Theron with the predatory grace of a woman who had been managing crises for decades. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her silk blouse immaculate, her pearl earrings catching the light as she approached me like a diplomat approaching a delicate negotiation. "Let's all take a breath," she said, her voice dripping with false calm. "This is clearly a shock, Seraphina, and you're entitled to your emotions. But surely you understand that what happens next must be handled with discretion." "Discretion?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want me to be discreet about the fact that you passed off your butler's son as your heir? That my entire marriage is based on lies?" "Your marriage is perfectly legal," Cordelia replied smoothly. "You married Theron Valamont. That is his name, legally. It has been since we adopted him when he was 16. The word hit me like a physical blow. Adopted. There was a legal framework to this deception, layers of documentation and carefully constructed legitimacy. They had thought of everything. "Cassius died when he was 15, Cordelia continued, and for the first time I heard a tremor in her voice. "A sailing accident. He was our only child, the sole heir to the Valamont fortune. Leopold was devastated. The family name, the business, everything we had built for generations, it all required an heir. So we made one." I looked at Theron, searching for some sign of the man I had married beneath this stranger's face. "Your father is Aldrich, the butler." He flinched, then nodded slowly. "My mother was a maid here when I was born. She died when I was 3. Aldrich raised me in the servants' quarters until I was 16. Then Cassius died, and the Valamonts offered my father a choice." "What choice?" It was Aldrich who answered. I hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly he was there, standing in the corridor behind me with a silver tea service on a tray, as if this were any ordinary evening. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes, gray like Theron's, I now realized with a jolt, were swimming with decades of suppressed emotion. "They offered me a choice between my son's future and my own integrity," Aldrich said quietly. "I chose my son. Whether that was wisdom or weakness, I have questioned every day since." I stared at him, this silent man who had served me tea and answered my questions about household matters with respectful efficiency for 3 years. This man who was my father-in-law, though the world would never know it. "Theron was brilliant," Aldrich continued. "Even as a child, I knew he was destined for more than polishing silver and pressing linens. When the Valamonts came to me after Cassius died, they offered him everything: education, opportunity, a future beyond anything I could provide. All he had to do was become someone else. All he had to do was live a lie," I corrected bitterly. "Yes." Aldrich's voice was heavy with sorrow. "And the weight of that lie has grown heavier every year, especially after he fell in love with you." I turned back to Theron, who looked as broken as I felt. The man who had brought me coffee at midnight, who had kissed me in the half-finished library, who had promised me forever beneath the wisteria. He was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of deception. But could I ever trust him again? "I was supposed to marry someone of Cordelia's choosing," Theron said, his voice hoarse. "Someone from another wealthy family, someone who would seal business alliances and produce appropriately pedigreed heirs. But then you walked into that design firm and everything changed. She was not supposed to be part of this, Cordelia interjected sharply. You deviated from the plan, Theron. You were supposed to follow the script. I couldn't. Theron's voice cracked. For the first time in my life, something felt real. She felt real. And I wanted to tell you the truth so many times, Seraphina. But I was terrified of losing you. So you kept lying instead. I kept hoping I could find a way to make it right, to tell you myself, on my terms, in a way that might help you understand. Understand what? I was trembling now, anger and grief warring within me. That everything about our life is built on a foundation of deception? That every time you told me you loved me, there was a massive secret sitting between us? The love was never a lie, Theron said desperately. The love was the only true thing. But I couldn't hear him. I couldn't process anything beyond the roaring in my ears and the sensation that the floor was tilting beneath my feet. My entire identity for the past 3 years had been Mrs. Vallemont, wife of a billionaire heir. I had walked through the world differently, seen myself differently, built a future on the assumption that I knew who I had married. And now? Now I was just a girl from Belhaven who had been fooled by a fairy tale that never existed. I turned and walked away. Theron called after me, but I didn't stop. I walked through the grand corridor, past the portraits of Vallemont ancestors who were not my husband's blood relatives, past the library where we had shared our first kiss, past the windows overlooking gardens maintained by staff who had probably known the truth all along. Every step felt like wading through quicksand. I made it to our bedroom, with its hand-carved mahogany bed and silk canopy, its walk-in closets full of designer clothes, and its windows overlooking the estate's private lake. And I stood there, surrounded by evidence of a life that was suddenly foreign to me. The photographs on the nightstand showed a happy couple, our wedding day, frozen in silver frames, a vacation in the Maldives, a charity gala where we had danced until midnight. In every image, Theron smiled with what I had believed was genuine joy. Now I looked at those photographs and wondered what secrets lurked behind his eyes even then. I began to pack a bag. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan beyond the primal need to escape. My hands shook as I pulled clothes from hangers and shoved them into luggage without care for wrinkles or coordination. The designer labels that had once thrilled me now felt like costumes from a play I had unwittingly been cast in. A soft knock came at the door. Before I could respond, it opened, and a woman slipped inside. Heloise, the head housekeeper, a kind-eyed woman in her 50s who had always treated me with warmth that seemed to exceed professional obligation. Mrs. Vallemont, Seraphina, she corrected herself, approaching me slowly. I know you're hurting right now, but before you leave, there are things you should know. My voice broke. I can't hear any more revelations tonight. These are things that might matter later, Heloise said gently. Things about the Vallemonts that they've worked very hard to hide. I paused, a cashmere sweater clutched in my hands. What are you talking about? Heloise glanced toward the door, as if ensuring we were alone. The Vallemonts aren't just wealthy. They're powerful in ways that extend far beyond their bank accounts. They have politicians in their pockets. They've destroyed people who crossed them. And this arrangement with Theron, it wasn't just about having an heir. It was about control. Control of what? Control of the narrative. control of the family empire, and control of Theron himself. Heloise's voice dropped lower. He's not the villain in this story, Seraphina. He's as much a prisoner as you've been, perhaps even more so. He's been under their thumb since he was 16 years old, molded into a puppet that could dance on their strings. I wanted to dismiss her words as the excuses of a woman loyal to a man who had deceived me, but something in her earnest expression gave me pause. Why are you telling you this? Because I've watched you for 3 years, Heloise said. I've seen how you treat the staff, like people, not furniture. I've seen how you love Theron, and I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Whatever else is false about this situation, that love is real. And I think you deserve to know the whole truth before you decide what to do with it. Before I could respond, the door burst open again. Cordelia stood in the doorway, her composure finally cracked, her eyes blazing with fury. That's quite enough, Heloise, she said coldly. You may return to your duties. And Seraphina, we need to discuss the terms of your departure. Terms? I stared at her. You mean you're just going to let me leave? Cordelia smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, you're going to leave. That was never in question. The only question is what you leave with, and what you keep silent about. She stepped closer, and I saw the predator beneath the polished surface. You've signed a prenuptial agreement. You'll walk away with nothing except what you brought into this marriage, which, as I recall, was very little. And if you breathe a word of what you've learned tonight to anyone, the consequences will be significant. The threat hung in the air between us, cold and unmistakable. You can't just silence me, I said, though my voice wavered. Can't I? Cordelia's smile widened. My dear, you have no idea what I can do. I left Thornwood Hall that night with a single suitcase and a heart full of broken glass. Cordelia's driver took me to a hotel in the city. A nice hotel, to be sure, but nothing compared to the opulence I had grown accustomed to. The room felt sterile and anonymous, a beige box that echoed with the absence of everything I had lost. I sat on the edge of the bed for hours, staring at the wall, replaying every moment of my marriage in search of signs I should have seen. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Cordelia's persistent coldness, despite my every effort to please her. The strange sadness that sometimes crossed Theron's face when he looked at his reflection. The way Aldrich's gaze would linger on his son, with an expression I now recognized as paternal pride and profound grief. The evidence had been there all along. I had simply refused to see it. My phone buzzed constantly. Theron calling and texting, leaving voicemails that I couldn't bring myself to listen to. My best friend Nadia, who had clearly heard something was wrong and was demanding to know what had happened. My mother, whose call I eventually answered simply because I knew she wouldn't stop until I did. Seraphina, sweetheart, what's going on? Nadia called me in a panic. She said something about you leaving Theron? It's complicated, Mom. My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Then uncomplicate it for me. Are you hurt? Are you safe? Do I need to come there? The simple concern in her voice, so different from the calculated manipulations of the Valamonts, broke something inside me. I began to cry, deep, racking sobs that seemed to pour out from some bottomless well of grief. He's not who I thought he was, I managed between gasps. The whole thing was a lie. My entire marriage, my life, all of it. My mother listened as I poured out the story, interrupting only to ask clarifying questions. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Come home," she finally said. "Come back to Belhaven. Whatever else happens, you have a place here. You have me." I wanted to. God, how I wanted to retreat to the salt air comfort of my childhood town, to hide from the world in my mother's small cottage and pretend none of this had ever happened. But something stubborn inside me, something that had survived poverty and abandonment and years of being underestimated, refused to run. "Not yet," I said. "I need to think. I need to figure out who I am now." "You're Seraphina Marlowe," my mother replied firmly. "You've always been Seraphina Marlowe. Everything else is just decoration." Her words stayed with me through the sleepless night and into the gray morning that followed. I was Seraphina Marlowe. I had existed before Theron, before the Valamonts, before the fairy tale that had turned into a nightmare. I could exist again. But first, I needed answers. Real answers, not the carefully scripted explanations that Cordelia had offered. I needed to understand who Theron really was. Not the billionaire heir, not the butler's son playing pretend, but the actual man beneath both masks. I called Eloise on the number she had slipped into my pocket before I left. "I need to meet with Aldrich," I said. "Somewhere away from Thornwood Hall. Somewhere Cordelia won't know about." There was a pause. "That's dangerous. If Cordelia finds out..." "She's already threatened me. What more can she do?" Another pause. "You might be surprised. But yes, I'll arrange it. There's a cafe in the old Port District, a place called the Weathered Anchor. Tomorrow at 3. Aldrich will be there." I spent the rest of that day walking through the city, seeing it with new eyes. The boutiques where I had once shopped without checking price tags. The restaurants where we had celebrated anniversaries and closed business deals. The art galleries where my husband, no, not my husband, not really, had introduced me to collectors and critics as his wife, his partner, his beloved. Each location held memories that now felt tainted by the knowledge of what had been hidden from me. But as I walked, something unexpected began to happen. The initial shock was wearing off, and in its place, a new emotion was taking root. Anger. Not just at the deception, but at the way I had allowed myself to be defined by my marriage. For 3 years, I had been Mrs. Valamont first, and Seraphina Marlowe second. I had let their money and status subsume my identity, had worked so hard to fit into their world that I had nearly forgotten where I came from. No more. The Weathered Anchor was exactly the kind of place the Valamonts would never deign to enter. A weathered establishment on a rickety pier, smelling of salt and fried fish, filled with dock workers and fishermen who paid no attention to the gray-haired man sitting alone in a back corner. Aldrich looked different outside of Thornwood Hall. Smaller somehow, without the grand architecture to frame him. He was wearing ordinary clothes, a fisherman's sweater and worn trousers, and his hands were wrapped around a mug of tea as if seeking warmth. "Mrs. Valamont," he started, rising slightly as I approached. "Seraphina," I corrected, sliding into the seat across from him. "Given the circumstances, I think we can drop the formalities." He nodded slowly, his eyes studying my face with an intensity that reminded me uncomfortably of Theron. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I wasn't sure you would." Neither was I. I signaled the waitress for coffee, needing something to do with my hands. I have questions. I expected you would. I'll answer what I can. Let's start with the obvious. You're Theron's real father. His mother worked here as a maid. Her name was Emmeline. A softness entered Aldrich's weathered face. She was beautiful and kind, and far too good for the life this place offered her. She died of pneumonia when Theron was barely 3. I raised him in the servants' quarters from then on, teaching him to read, to think, to dream beyond our circumstances. And when Cassius died, the Valamonts came to you with their proposition. They came to me with a threat disguised as an opportunity. Aldrich's jaw tightened. Leopold made it very clear that if I refused, I would be dismissed without reference after 30 years of service. I would never find another position at my age. Theron and I would be left with nothing. So you agreed to let them take your son. I agreed to let them give my son a future. Aldrich's voice cracked slightly. You must understand, Seraphina. I watched Theron grow up in servants' quarters, wearing hand-me-down clothes, knowing he was brilliant enough to change the world if only he had the opportunity. When the Valamonts offered him education, resources, a name that could open doors, how could I refuse? I thought of my own mother, working her fingers raw to give me opportunities she never had. I thought of the choices parents make, the sacrifices that look like love and betrayal all at once. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you were in Aldrich's position, watching your brilliant child grow up in circumstances that limited their potential, offered the chance to give them everything at the cost of losing them to another identity, what would you do? Would love make you sacrifice their truth for their future? Think about that for a moment and share your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you think, because this question haunted me for months after I learned the truth. What about Theron? I asked. Did he have a choice? He was 16, old enough to understand what was being offered, young enough to be dazzled by it. Aldrich sighed. And he did it partly for me. He knew I was getting older, knew that serving the Valamonts was the only life I knew. If he became their heir, I could stay. I could be near him, even if we could never acknowledge each other publicly. The tragedy of it was almost unbearable. Father and son, living in the same house for over a decade, maintaining a pretense of employer and servant while their true relationship remained hidden in shadows. Did he love Cassius? I asked. The real heir? Aldrich looked surprised by the question. They barely knew each other. Cassius was troubled, volatile. He had episodes of rage and periods of deep darkness. The sailing accident was officially ruled an accident, but there were whispers. Whispers of what? Aldrich looked around the cafe before leaning closer. Whispers that it wasn't an accident, that Cassius took his own life, or that someone helped him take it. I don't know the truth, but Cordelia's grief afterwards was complicated. There was sorrow, yes, but also something that looked almost like relief. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of family had I married into? And Theron? Was he groomed to replace Cassius, or to become him? Both. Aldrich's face was pained. They made him study Cassius's mannerisms, his history, his preferences. For the first 2 years, they tried to make Theron into a copy of their dead son. It nearly broke him. But eventually they realized it was impossible. Theron is too fundamentally himself to be molded into someone else entirely. So they settled for making him Theron Valamont, adopted son, and let the world forget the details. The world, I said bitterly, but not me. I was supposed to be his wife. I was supposed to know him. He wanted to tell you. Aldrich's voice was urgent now. From the moment he fell in love with you, he wanted to tell you everything. But the Valamonts have ways of ensuring silence. They threatened to destroy you if he revealed the truth. They threatened to expose me, to ruin both of us. He was trapped, Seraphina. He loved you enough to want to protect you, even if it meant lying to you. I didn't know what to do with that information. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it complicated it, made it harder to draw clean lines between victim and villain. What do they have on you? I asked. What keeps you both under their control? Aldrich hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a younger version of himself, standing next to a beautiful woman with auburn hair. Emmeline, I assumed. But there was a third figure in the image that made my blood run cold. Leopold Valamont, his arm around Emmeline's waist, looking at her with unmistakable possessiveness. Theron isn't just my son, Aldrich said quietly. He's Leopold's son, too. Emmeline and I loved each other, but Leopold believed he had rights to her, to all of them. The maids' children, the staff's families. They were his to use as he pleased. I stared at the photograph, understanding crashing over me like waves. Theron is Leopold's biological son. Yes, which means he is a real Valamont, by blood if not by name. It's the ultimate irony. They adopted their own son and called him an imposter. And Leopold knows. He's always known. Which is why he was so willing to make Theron his heir. The bloodline continues, even if the world thinks otherwise. The revelation about Leopold left me reeling. Theron was a Valamont by blood, the product of Leopold's exploitation of a young maid who had no power to refuse him. It made the situation both more tragic and more complicated than I had imagined. I spent the following days in a fog, trying to process what I had learned. The hotel room became my prison and my sanctuary, a place where I could fall apart without witnesses. I barely ate, barely slept, barely did anything except stare at the walls and replay conversations in my head. But grief, I was learning, has a shelf life. And when mine finally expired, what emerged from its ashes was something harder, more determined. I began to make plans. The first step was meeting with a lawyer, not one connected to the Valamonts, but an independent attorney named Jacinda Thorne, who specialized in complicated family matters. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had clearly seen every possible variation of wealthy dysfunction. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad, she said after reviewing my documents. Cordelia's lawyers are the best money can buy, and they covered every possible exit strategy. If you divorce Theron, you leave with essentially nothing. I don't care about the money, I said, and meant it. I care about the truth. Jacinda raised an eyebrow. The truth is a more complicated commodity. If you go public with what you know, the Valamonts will destroy your credibility. They'll call you a scorned wife, making up stories for revenge. They have media connections, political allies, resources you can't begin to match. So what are you suggesting? That I just walk away and pretend none of this happened? I'm suggesting that you be strategic. Jacinda leaned forward. The Valmonts have survived for generations by controlling information. If you want to expose them, you need evidence, documentation, witnesses willing to testify. You need to build a case so airtight that their money and influence can't paper over it. It was a daunting prospect. The Valmonts had spent decades perfecting their facade. How could I, with my limited resources and connections, possibly bring it crumbling down? But I had one advantage they hadn't counted on. I had been inside the house. I had been trusted, or at least tolerated, for 3 years. I knew where the cracks in their armor were. I started with Eloise, who agreed to provide me with information about the estate's inner workings. Then I reached out to other staff members who had left Thornwood Hall under questionable circumstances. A gardener who had been dismissed for asking too many questions, a cook who had witnessed Leopold's behavior with young maids, a chauffeur who had driven Cordelia to secret meetings with politicians and journalists. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to assemble a picture of the Valamont Empire that went far beyond a simple case of hidden identity. There were bribes and blackmail, political corruption and financial fraud. The family fortune wasn't just inherited. It was maintained through a web of illegal activities that would make any prosecutor salivate. But the centerpiece of my case was simpler. It was the truth about Theron and about Cassius. I found a former nurse who had treated Cassius in the years before his death. She had been sworn to secrecy, paid handsomely for her silence, but time and distance had loosened her loyalty. Cassius was mentally ill, she told me over a video call. Severely so. The Valamonts refused to acknowledge it publicly, but he had been institutionalized twice before his death. There were violent episodes. There were suicide attempts. And there was evidence that he had been, she hesitated, abused by someone in the household. By Leopold? The nurse's face confirmed what she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. The official story was a sailing accident, I pressed. But you don't believe that. The official story was whatever the Valamonts paid people to believe. That's how it's always worked. As my investigation deepened, something unexpected happened. I began to receive messages from Theron. Not the desperate pleas of the first days, but something more measured, more honest. Seraphina, I know you're gathering information about my family. I know you're planning something. I want to help. I stared at the message for hours before responding. Why should I trust you? His reply came immediately. You shouldn't. But you should know that I've been waiting for someone brave enough to bring them down since I was 16 years old. I just never thought I could do it myself. I was too afraid, too controlled. But watching you walk away from everything they offered, watching you choose truth over comfort, you showed me what courage looks like. We began to communicate cautiously. He provided me with access codes and hidden documents. He revealed where Cordelia kept her private files and which servants were still loyal to the family versus those who might be persuaded to testify. He was, I realized, dismantling his own gilded cage from the inside, while I built the case from the outside. It was during one of these covert exchanges that he told me the full truth about his feelings. I knew from the moment I saw you that you were going to destroy the world they built. I just didn't know if you'd destroy me with it. And I decided that if you did, it would be worth it. Loving you, really loving you, made the lies unbearable. You made me want to be the man you thought I was. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me still raged at his deception, at the years of lies that had stolen my ability to trust. But another part of me, the part that remembered midnight coffee and kisses in the library, still felt the pull of the connection we had shared. "We can't be what we were," I finally wrote. "I don't know if we can be anything at all." "I know," he replied. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to finally be honest. Whatever happens after that is your choice." 6 months passed. 6 months of investigation, of building alliances, of transforming myself from a discarded wife into something the Valmonts had never expected, a genuine threat. During that time, I reconnected with my work in interior design, taking on small projects that slowly rebuilt my professional reputation, independent of my married name. I moved out of the hotel and into a modest apartment that I paid for with my own earnings. I began to remember who I had been before I became Mrs. Valmont, and I discovered that I liked that woman better than the polished version I had performed for 3 years. I also stayed in touch with Nadia, my best friend from before the fairy tale, who had been concerned, but not surprised, by my marriage's implosion. "I always knew there was something off about him," she said over coffee one afternoon. "Not him specifically. He always seemed genuine when he looked at you. But that family, the way his mother watched everyone like she was cataloging weaknesses, the way the whole house felt like a stage set rather than a home." "Why didn't you say anything?" Nadia shrugged. "Would you have listened? You were in love. You were living the dream. Who was I to tell you it was a nightmare in disguise?" She had a point. I had been so desperate to believe in the fairy tale that I had ignored every warning sign. It was a humbling realization, but also a liberating one. I could not change the past. I could only shape the future. And the future, I decided, would include the downfall of the Valmont Empire. The confrontation came on a day I had chosen carefully, the annual Valmont Foundation Gala, the family's most public event, attended by politicians, celebrities, and media moguls. If I was going to expose them, I wanted the whole world watching. I had not been invited, of course. Cordelia had made sure my name was removed from every guest list the moment I left Thornwood Hall. But I had something better than an invitation. I had credentials, press credentials, courtesy of an investigative journalist named Raphael, who had been trying to get inside the Valmont world for years and was more than happy to have me as his inside source. I walked into the ballroom on his arm, wearing a dress I had designed myself. Deep red, deceptively simple, nothing like the ornate gowns Cordelia had selected for me during my time as Mrs. Valmont. Several heads turned as I entered, whispers spreading like wildfire. The discarded wife, returning to the scene of her humiliation. They expected drama. They had no idea what was coming. I spotted Cordelia across the room, resplendent in silver silk, holding court among her usual circle of admirers. She saw me at the same moment, and her perfectly composed face flickered with something that might have been fear, before settling back into cold disdain. "Seraphina," she said as I approached, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen around us. "What an unexpected surprise. I wasn't aware you were on the guest list." "I wasn't," I replied, "but I have information that I thought your guests might find interesting." Cordelia's eyes narrowed. "Whatever petty grievances you've nursed since our parting, this is neither the time nor the place. On the contrary, I interrupted. This is exactly the time and place. These are exactly the people who need to hear what your family has been hiding. I signaled Raphael, who had positioned himself near the event's media center. The massive screens that had been displaying the Valmont Foundation's charitable accomplishments flickered and changed. Documents began to appear. Financial records showing years of fraud and embezzlement from the very foundation they were celebrating tonight. Photographs linking Leopold to political figures who had mysteriously changed their positions on legislation that benefited Valmont enterprises. Recordings of Cordelia threatening journalists who had gotten too close to the truth. And finally, the pièce de résistance, a video interview with Aldrich, speaking on camera for the first time in his life, revealing the truth about his son's identity, about Leopold's exploitation of Emmeline, about the lies that had built the Valmont legacy. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Guests shouted questions. Journalists scrambled for better positions. Security personnel tried to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond their capacity to manage. Cordelia stood frozen, her carefully maintained composure finally shattered, watching decades of constructed narrative collapse in real time. Leopold tried to flee, but police officers were already at the exits. The evidence I had gathered had been quietly provided to federal investigators weeks earlier. Tonight was simply the public execution of a case that had already been sealed behind closed doors. In the midst of the chaos, I felt a hand touch my elbow. I turned to find Theron standing beside me, his face a mixture of relief and grief. "You did it," he said quietly. "You actually did it." "We did it," I corrected. "I couldn't have gotten those documents without you. It needed to happen." He looked around at the crumbling empire he had been forced to represent for so many years. "It should have happened a long time ago. I was just too afraid to be the one who lit the match. And now?" He met my eyes, and I saw the man I had fallen in love with. Not the polished heir, not the butler's secret son, but the person beneath both masks. Damaged, yes. Complicated, certainly. But genuine in a way he had never been allowed to be before. Now I have to figure out who I am without their name, their money, their script. He smiled, but it was tinged with uncertainty. "I don't know if I know how to be just Theron." "Neither did I said. "Neither did I know how to be just Seraphina after being Mrs. Valmont for so long. But I figured it out. You will too." The aftermath of the gala was everything I had hoped for and more. The Valmont empire crumbled under the weight of the revelations. Leopold and Cordelia were arrested, their assets frozen pending investigation. The foundation was shut down, its charitable works transferred to legitimate organizations that would actually help the causes they claimed to support. And Theron, legally still Theron Valmont, though the name now carried infamy rather than prestige, walked away from all of it. He refused his inheritance, declined his position in the family business, and publicly acknowledged Aldrich as his father. It was the first honest thing he had done in the public eye. And while the media initially treated it as scandal, the narrative gradually shifted as people began to understand the abuse and manipulation that had shaped his circumstances. I watched all of this from a distance, still uncertain about where or if Theron fit into my future. The love was still there, buried beneath layers of hurt and anger and grief. But I had learned the hard way that love alone was not enough. Trust was essential, and trust had to be rebuilt from nothing. We began tentatively. Coffee, in public places, with boundaries clearly established. Conversations that were sometimes painful, sometimes healing, always honest. He told me things about his childhood that broke my heart. The isolation, the fear, the way he had been stripped of his identity and rebuilt in Cassius's image. I told him about the ways his deception had affected me, the doubts I now carried about my own judgment, the difficulty I had trusting anyone, the loneliness of realizing that my marriage had been a performance. Slowly, painfully, we learned who we really were. Not the billionaire heir and his adoring wife. Not the victim and the deceiver. Just two people who had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control, trying to find their way forward. A year after the gala, I stood on the porch of a small cottage overlooking the ocean in Belhaven. Not my mother's cottage, but one I had purchased myself with money earned from my own design business, which had flourished in the wake of my unexpected notoriety. It turned out that being the woman who brought down the Valmont empire was excellent for attracting clients who valued integrity over pretension. The salt air filled my lungs, and I felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. The woman who had stood in that corridor at Thornwood Hall, heart shattering among broken crystal, felt like a distant memory. She had been transformed by the fire of betrayal into someone stronger, more authentic, more herself. A car pulled into the driveway. Theron emerged, carrying a small bag and wearing clothes that looked nothing like the tailored suits of his previous life. Jeans, a worn sweater, sneakers that had actually been walked in. He looked more comfortable than I had ever seen him. "You came," I said as he climbed the porch steps. "You invited me," he smiled, that genuine smile that had first captured my heart in a design studio years ago. Though I wasn't sure you meant it. I meant it. I gestured to the chairs that overlooked the water. "Sit. We should talk." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the waves crash against the shore. The year since the gala had changed us both. Theron had worked with prosecutors to help build cases against other corrupt members of the elite circles his family had inhabited. He had reconnected with Aldrich, establishing a public relationship with his father for the first time. He had started therapy, begun the long process of untangling his identity from the role he had been forced to play. And he had waited. For me. Without pressure, without expectation. Just waiting to see if there might be a path back to each other. "I've been thinking," I finally said, "about what Heloise told me that night. About how you were as much a prisoner as I was." "I don't know if that's true," Theron replied. "I had choices. I made wrong ones. I hurt you." "You did," I agreed. "But I've also learned that the world is more complicated than I wanted it to be. Good people do bad things. Victims can also cause harm. Love can be real, even when it exists alongside deception." He turned to look at me, hope and fear warring in his expression. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've spent the last year learning to trust myself again, learning to define myself by my own terms, not by whose wife I was or what name I carried. And I've realized that part of trusting myself means trusting my heart, even when it tells me things that seem impossible." "And what does your heart tell you?" I took a deep breath. "That I never stopped loving you. That I've been angry and hurt and betrayed. But underneath all of that, the connection we had was real. Not the fairy tale. That was always an illusion. But the person beneath the performance. The man who brought me coffee at midnight and looked at me like I was the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. That man was real. And I think I want to know him properly this time." Tears were streaming down Theron's face. Genuine tears, not the controlled emotion of his Valmont years. "I don't deserve that. After everything I put you through." "It's not about deserving." I reached out and took his hand, feeling the warmth of him, the realness of this moment after so many months of uncertainty. It's about choosing. And I'm choosing to give us a chance. A real chance, with no secrets, no pretenses, no masks. He brought my hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that choice. I know you will. We sat there as the sun set over the ocean, two people who had been shaped by deception finding their way back to truth. It wasn't a fairy tale. I had learned the hard way that fairy tales were just pretty lies. But it was real. Messy and complicated and wounded, but real. In the months that followed, Theron moved to Belhaven. Not into my cottage. We were taking things slowly this time. But into a small house nearby where he could be close to me, close to the ocean, close to the simple life that neither of us had ever expected to embrace. He found work with a local nonprofit organization, helping families navigate complex legal situations, using the knowledge he had gained from his years in the Valmont world to help others escape similar traps. Aldrich visited often. He and Theron were finally building the relationship they had been denied for so many years, father and son, without pretense or performance. Sometimes I would come home to find them sitting on my porch, talking quietly, making up for lost time. It healed something in both of them, and in me too, to witness love triumphing over decades of enforced distance. My mother adored Theron, once she got past her initial suspicion. "He looks at you the way your father never looked at me," she told me one afternoon while we were cooking together. "Like you're the most important person in any room. That kind of love is rare. Hold on to it." And I did. We both did. A year after Theron moved to Belhaven, he proposed again. Not with a sapphire ring that had supposedly belonged to a French countess, but with a simple band he had designed himself, made from sea glass collected from the beach where we walked every evening. "I don't have a family name to offer you anymore," he said, kneeling in the sand as the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. "I don't have wealth or status or any of the things I once thought defined a man's worth. All I have is myself, the real me, finally, for the first time in my life. And I'm asking you to marry him, if you'll have him." I said yes. Our wedding was small. My mother, Aldrich, Nadia, a handful of friends we had made in our new life. No magazines begged to feature it. No 300 guests watched us exchange vows. No butler stood in the corner hiding the truth of his relationship to the groom. Instead, Aldrich walked his son to the altar, publicly and proudly, a father giving away the child he had been forced to deny for so many years. It was the most moving thing I had ever witnessed. When I think back now on the woman who heard those words in the corridor, "You are the butler's secret son, playing a role we scripted for you," I feel compassion for her. She was shattered that night. She thought her life was over. She didn't know that it was just beginning. Do you remember what I said at the very start of this story? That when you marry into money, you inherit secrets, silence, and lies? It's true. I inherited all of those things during my first marriage to Theron Valmont, billionaire heir. But in my second marriage, to Theron Aldrich Marlowe, the name he chose when he finally got to pick his own identity, I inherited something different. I inherited honesty. I inherited authenticity. I inherited a partner who had walked through fire to become the man he was always meant to be. I thought I married a billionaire, but he was the butler's secret son. And in the end, that made him exactly the man I needed. Not the polished performance of wealth and status, but a real person, forged in struggle, choosing love over lies. Some stories end with revenge. Some end with wealth reclaimed or enemies destroyed. This one ends with something simpler, and to me, far more valuable. It ends with truth. It ends with two people who found each other in the wreckage of a lie and decided to build something honest from the pieces. It ends with love, real love, the kind that survives betrayal and chooses to believe in second chances. And it ends with me, Seraphina Marlowe, standing on a porch overlooking the ocean, finally home. Not in a mansion, not in luxury, but in the life I chose for myself. That, I have learned, is the only fairy tale worth believing in, the one you write yourself.